This is Jill Pack with the Seasons of Joy podcast. This is episode number 105, entitled The ABCs of Disempowerment. Are you a woman of faith who is struggling to navigate your current season of life? Do you feel like life is just happening to you instead of for you? My name is Jill Pack, and I'm a certified faith-based life coach and a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I want you to know that no matter your season or your circumstance, it is possible to create a more joyful life, and I would love to show you how. Are you ready? Let's go. Hello, my friends. Welcome to this week's podcast episode. I'm so glad you're here. I hope you're doing well. Today, I actually went out on 2 walks because the sun was shining, the skies were blue, and I just needed some vitamin D. So it was awesome. I loved it. So it's just kind of like it's in the air, like new beginnings, fresh starts, like the beginnings of the flowers are starting to peek out, right? The annuals are or the perennials. That's what they are. Perennials are starting to peek out, and it's in the air. It's so beautiful. And so it's making me think like this is the perfect time to step into a new season of your life. So if you're finding yourself in a season of wanting to create some change in your life, I would love to be your coach. I coach women in the mid-season of life, women of faith that are trying to navigate the different transitions that come at that season of life. If you're ready to reconnect with yourself and build that relationship with self, I would love to be your coach. If you are struggling in a relationship in your life, whether it's your spouse, your adult children, or an employer, or your friend, I would love to be your coach. If you're feeling disconnected from God and you would like to create greater connection to Him, I would love to be your coach. So if you want to work with me in my Season of Creation one-on-one 12-week coaching program, I would love to be your coach. Come with me and spend a season working on your relationship with yourself, with others, or with God. I'd love to be your coach. Now on to this week's episode. This week, I want to spend some time talking about the ABCs of disempowerment and how they play a factor in the kind of relationships we have with other people and even with ourselves. But I want to begin by asking you this question. What version of you shows up in your relationships? And this is a question that Terrence asks in his book called Us. It's such a good book, and some of this beginning stuff that I'm going to be talking about is from his book. He is a therapist and does some really good work on relationships. And so that's a question he asked that I want to extend to you. I want you to think for a minute, what version of you shows up in your relationships, right? Think of those times when you're in the heat of the moment, right? An unkind word comes out, a raised voice, or you lash out, or you shut down, or you become overwhelmed, right? Those reactions that occur in the heat of the moment. Well, the truth is we all have moments like that. That's called humanity. And one of my mentors, Natalie Clay, I love how she describes that we have moments in time. Sometimes we can define our relationships by the moments when there are so many other moments that are good and happy, right? But we can tend to go to the negative and define our relationship by those negative moments. And so we want to recognize that there are moments. And if we can step back and view it from that way, we can begin to shift and change those moments. So think about those relationships that you're struggling in, and what is your reaction in the heat of the moment, right? And then do you blow things out of proportion? Do you do some of those things that I said? Say a kind word, raise your voice, lash out, or shut down, right? How do you show up in that relationship that perhaps you're struggling in? And then after that moment is over, Do you spend time trying to manage the damage, right? Control the aftermath? Or do you just pretend like it never happened, right? Sometimes we cope in one of those ways, but other times we have a little tinge of regret, right? We wish maybe we would have shown up differently. And that is a sign that you are ready for change, right? Regret can actually be a good thing. It can tell us that what we're doing or how we're behaving isn't aligned with who we want to be. So we can use that regret as a motivator to move towards change. Now, change needs to come, and this is something that Terrence says in his book. It begins by changing the way you see yourself in relation to the other person so that life isn't a desert or a battlefield, right? So that we're not so disconnected that there's nothing there, and we're not so entrenched in fighting that we've created a battlefield. There's somewhere else that's so much better than that, right? And it requires us to view ourselves as sitting on the same side of the table as the other person. This allows us to become us, right? We need to remember that we still love those people that we're in relationship with, right? That is the good news, that even though we're struggling, there is love there. But the bad news is, as Terrence says, it's stored in the parts of your brain, your body, and your nervous system that in those flash moments, you no longer inhabit, right? Like we aren't living in those parts of our brain and in our body because we're in this moment, and that our higher brain or our prefrontal cortex is offline in those moments, and the primitive parts of our brain have taken over. This causes us to lose the ability to pause between what we feel and what we do. This part of the brain is all about survival. It wants to keep us safe. It's perceiving danger, right? So we are no longer us. We have become you and me. One of us wins and one of us loses. So us is about connection and about closeness. You and me is going against each other. Now, when we're you and me, this works great when we're confronted by a grizzly bear, right? But it doesn't work that great when we're confronting our spouse, our boss, or our child, right? Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but we also can look at the trauma that we've experienced in our life, right? We've all have different experiences in our life up to this point where we've had to create coping strategies, especially when we're young, right? We've done things because we don't understand what's happening. And so we naturally create the ability to cope by different strategies that make us feel safe and secure, right? So those coping strategies come out when we are triggered or activated in some way. We show up from that place. I was thinking about this recently. Years ago, in 2020, my mom passed away. And on the way home from her funeral, I witnessed a motorcycle accident. And it was very traumatic. A motorcyclist hit a semi, and my daughter and I witnessed it. And it was really traumatic. And it affected me for quite a while. And then it was kind of, I kind of softened and I didn't think about it as often. But then last year I was in St. George with my husband, and there was a motorcycle and a semi, and the reaction that came up in my body was so automatic that I didn't even realize. I just broke down sobbing. And so it's really interesting to notice that sometimes those things are stored in our body and they do come up, and we're reaching for those coping strategies to navigate those things like that. Our body remembers, right? So we may show up in a way because of the strategies we've had to create to cope as we've grown up. But the thing that's interesting that I think that Terrence I love how he describes this. He compares what he calls the adaptive child and the wise adult. Now, that adaptive child is the one that had to create those coping strategies, right? But the adaptive child has tendencies like black and white thinking. It's either this or this. Perfectionistic, right? Things have to be perfect. We're relentless. It just has to be a certain way. We're rigid. We're harsh. We're certain. And it's really tight and constrictive in the body. Can you see that? Because it all comes from a lack of feeling unsafe or the need for control, right? Whereas the wise adult is more nuanced, right? It's realistic. It knows that we aren't perfect and that we're all human, right? There is no black and white. We're more forgiving because we can see the humanness in all of us. We're flexible, we're warm, we're yielding, we're humble, and we're more relaxed in the body. We're present, right? So when we are able to use our prefrontal cortex, we are operating from our wise adult. When we move into our coping strategies or we're feeling threatened in some way, we go to that adaptive child and we react in certain ways, right? Which don't create connection or strengthen our relationships. So how do we meet our adaptive child? And Terrence Real calls it a relational stance. We need to see or discover what our relational stance is. That is that set point reaction when we become activated or triggered in some way, right? So for example, there's a relationship in my life where my adaptive child goes to a freeze or a fawn. I freeze, I don't like the confrontation, and then I begin fawning. I try to make the other person feel more comfortable. You over apologize and try to manage their emotions in effort to protect myself, right? Or there are other relationships where it can be the fight or the flee, right? There's different reactions that we go to as our relational stance, and it may vary from relationship to relationship. So that's how we can begin to be introduced or meet our adaptive child. So how do we move from that automatic relational stance, right? Well, it requires us to step out of that adaptive child and move into our wise adult. This takes intention. It takes practice. It requires us to be brave enough to slow down, to create a pause between how we feel and how we act. And we can begin practicing being proactive instead of reactive. And we can begin by thinking relationally, right? Thinking about us instead of you and me. So I wanted to kind of introduce this podcast with those concepts as I move into the ABCs of disempowerment, because I think that these two are ways that the adaptive child reacts, or we have these patterned behaviors and beliefs and reactions because of some of that relational stance, right? And so they can actually become clues to us that we are operating out of that adaptive child, and we can learn from it and learn from these ABCs to help us to move towards that wise adult. So I want to talk about what those ABCs of disempowerment are. The first one is about you. It's when we are writing our story in a way that we are at the effect of someone or something else, right? We are being taken advantage of. We are being harmed. We are the center of the story, and we're making it all about us. This does not create connection, and it's very disempowering, right? It's hard to have a relationship, an intimate relationship, when we're making our stories about ourselves, because we're creating that me versus you mentality. The next one is blame, right? This is a lot of times the main thing that I see is that we are blaming other people for how we feel, right? That we're miserable because of somebody else. It's our husband's fault. It's our boyfriend's fault. It's our child's fault, right? And so we're giving away our power to someone else. The power of how we feel is because of somebody else. And we aren't taking responsibility for the way we're thinking, the way we're feeling, and the way we're behaving, right? We're the effect of someone else. And again, this creates a me versus you. It does not create an us. And so if we blame someone else, then it's not our fault. But again, this is disconnecting and we suffer. The next one is complaining. C is for complaining, right? When we are in this place of that adaptive child, we're complaining about what's happening. We're negative, right? And I know that when I am in the place of complaining, it spreads, it's addictive, it becomes a habit. And pretty soon we're complaining about a lot of different things in our life, about how we're treated. And we spin in this feeling sorry for ourselves and this self-pity, and that we feel trapped, right? And so the words that we say affect us. How often are we negative? And when we're negative, again, we're creating me against you. We are not creating a we. So we can notice, are we complaining? Do we do it a lot? What excuses are we coming up with for the way that we're behaving in our life? And the next one is defensiveness. And this kind of builds on the idea of blaming, right? And when we blame someone, we also have to come up with really good evidence of why it's someone else's fault and why we're right and they're wrong. Again, me versus you, not us, right? And that defensiveness really causes that contention. And I meant to say this in the beginning, like we're going to have conflict in our relationships, but the contention comes when we're operating out of that adaptive child and behaving in these ABCs of disempowerment, right? So when we feel like we have to defend ourself against other people, we are going to create disconnection and a me versus you mentality. And finally, there is E for escape. And when we notice ourselves like not wanting to be in the spotlight, we don't want to share our feelings. We want to avoid stuff. We don't want to express ourselves. We don't want to share our opinions, right? And if we do feel like we're being taken advantage of course, we're not going to want to share that because it feels dangerous, right? But the thing about these ABCs of disempowerment, they require us to have a villain in our story, right? It's created this you and me dynamic. There always has to be someone else to blame, right? Or to defend against, or to criticize, or to run away from, or to complain about, right? And so we've created this you and me, or this villain of our story. But when we don't need a villain in our story, we can begin to take responsibility for our own thoughts and our own words and our own decisions and our own actions. I want you to think about this example. If you go to a party and someone says something to you that maybe is unkind, right? You can have two different experiences. You can decide to move into your adaptive child and make it about you, or blame them, or complain, defend your reasons why, right? Or escape. And we're going to have a totally different experience than if we're at the party and someone says something that we don't believe is particularly kind. We can create a pause and we can choose. And one way I do that, and I've spoken to this on the podcast before, is the phrase, "That's interesting." That phrase invites me to get curious and to move out of finding a villain, right? That's so interesting that they decided to say that. That's so interesting that bothered me so badly. Why? Right? So the curiosity helps me step away from those ABCs of disempowerment. And it helps me begin to start choosing how I want to be and how I want to react in that situation. Same comment, but two different experiences, right? Sometimes we think that if we allow people to say or do certain things that we are a doormat. And one of the things that I learned in coach training was this idea of being a doormat versus rising above careless actions. When we allow other people's comments to devastate us, right, and put us into that adaptive child, we're giving someone else the power over our emotions and our well-being. That is a doormat. You could describe that as a doormat, right? Now, it doesn't mean we aren't going to say something back to the person that's maybe said something unkind, but we won't be saying it out of anger or out of a negative emotion, right? Because that negative emotion comes from what we're making that comment mean. And if someone says something unkind and you're able to blow it off instead of blowing up at them like an emotional, adaptive child, you are going to have a completely different experience. And that person's opinion and what that person says has everything to do with them and nothing to do with you. It's so important to understand that, right? Understanding that allows us to create that pause. And that question, that sentence, like, that's so interesting they said that. I wonder why. And we might get a peek into why they would say something like that, because maybe they're going through something that we had no idea that they were. And by creating that pause, we give ourselves the opportunity to stay in our integrity, right? We handle that situation as a wise adult. We create and stay in our emotional peace, right? We allow others to be where they are without going to their level. So it isn't about pretending, but it's about not dwelling on it and letting it get to you. That is not being a doormat. So the other thing we need to remember is that our negative emotions come from our negative thoughts, right? Or the thoughts that we have. And again, there aren't necessarily good or bad thoughts, but they're thoughts that create positive emotion, and there's thoughts that tend to create negative emotion. And when we realize that we create those emotions by what we think, that changes everything. So I've heard this example before. If someone came up to me and said, I really like your blue hair, I would look at him and go, I don't have blue hair. It wouldn't bother me at all, right? But it's painful when someone says something that part of us believes is true about ourselves, right? That's what hurts, because we think that they could be right? And so we want to pay attention to those pain points, right? And what they're causing for us. But when we can use the ABCs of disempowerment to help us step into what I call our superpower of feeling our emotions, everything changes, right? We can use those as a clue. Oh, I've noticed I'm complaining. I'm blaming the other person. I'm noticing I'm making this all about me. I'm noticing that I'm trying to escape this. I'm noticing that I feel like I need to defend myself, right? Those can be our clues that we are maybe operating out of that adaptive child. And so we can see the clue and take a deep breath and again, get curious and learn from it. Now, Byron Katie said, when you're willing to accept the parts of yourself that aren't perfect, you maintain your power, right? Because the truth is none of us are perfect. And maybe somebody points something out to us that does cause, right? Our beliefs about what they're saying does cause us some pain. But we can accept that little piece of truth and that maybe they're right about that, and that's okay. It doesn't mean we're less worthy or less important or less valuable or less lovable. It just means we're human, right? And so when we can recognize and let go of the negative emotions that come up for us in those moments, that can become our superpower. So we don't have to do the ABCs, right? We can learn from them and begin to move away from them by allowing ourselves to feel some of those uncomfortable emotions that come up in those relationships. That is a game changer. When we can be brave enough to step into the discomfort, that's when things will change. So how do we do this, right? We're learning how to recognize our adaptive child, and how do we step into that wise adult? How do we become that person that taps into the prefrontal cortex and can be more present and more flexible and more humble and more relaxed, right? How do we do that? Well, it's by stepping into vulnerability. Vulnerability is not a weakness, right? It is actually empowering. And Brené Brown talks on this a lot because she has studied and researched vulnerability and shame as a profession, right? And so she talks about vulnerability being just what I said, being willing to experience any emotion that comes up for you, right? It requires courage. It's not easy. It's not easy to feel uncomfortable. But if we can have the courage to do it, right, that's when things will change. Walking into the experience with ourselves and knowing that there is no emotion that will kill us, right? Like, our emotions are not going to kill us. They're not going to feel great, but they won't hurt us. They won't harm us. They won't kill us. There is no emotion that we need to hide from, right? We do not have to be afraid of them. They are vibrations in our body, and they're trying to teach us something. So if we can step into those experiences from a place of courage, everything will change. So what does that look like in our relationships? The ability to be vulnerable in our relationships is crucial. And it's crucial because the people that we are in relationship with will say and do things that will activate you to think and feel things that might be difficult, right? You and I are in all kinds of relationships. And my guess is that every relationship you have, somebody at one time or another has said or done something that has activated something in you. And I really believe that that's the purpose. I heard someone say that marriage is a people-growing machine. I can't remember who said it, but I think all relationships are that. Marriage particularly, for sure, but those other relationships in our life are the things that actually help us learn and grow to become a better version of ourselves. That bumping up and knocking against another person, right? And the way they believe and the way we believe and the way we feel and the way they feel, right? Those give us opportunity to really learn how to navigate and become a better version of ourselves, right? So vulnerability is important. So when we are not vulnerable, we are disempowered, right? If vulnerability creates empowerment, then the opposite of that is disempowered, right? And that comes through the ABCs that we talked about. We reject anything that isn't rainbows and daisies, right? We don't want to feel uncomfortable, so we reject everything that's not wonderful and loving, right? We also go to trying to control other people, what they say or what they do, because we're afraid. It really does all come from fear, that control. And it really is interesting how crazy and controlling we can get when we are afraid of feeling negative emotion. It's really interesting to pay attention to yourself as you work through those different dynamics in your relationships, right? Like, what do you notice? How are you showing up? And again, that goes back to my previous question at the very beginning, right? What version of you are you showing up in your relationships? So again, vulnerability is the opposite of disempowered. It is powerful. We are willing to expose ourselves to the uncomfortable emotions without having to do the ABCs, right? Making it about us, blaming other people, complaining, and I think you could put in there criticizing, feeling like we need to defend ourselves and trying to escape, right? We don't have to do those things. We can allow the uncomfortable emotions to come in. The thing is those ABCs are trying to push away the negative emotions, right? We're trying to avoid those negative emotions. So we resort to those coping mechanisms of those ABCs, which just leaves us disempowered, right? But when we step into vulnerability, we are inviting the wise adult into the relationship. And strength really does come through vulnerability. Like I said before, it isn't a weakness. When we can actually hear another person's feedback or opinions without the need to be defensive, that is intimacy, right? When we can allow someone to express themselves and be heard, that is intimacy. And it's just as important to do that with ourselves, right? To allow ourselves to be open and honest without judging. That is where strength lies. So if we were sitting at a table, right? And I heard it once explained, sitting across from each other at a table and hear someone's opinion of you, right? But I almost want to picture it as sitting on the same side of the table, right? Because that is what it is. The problem, the thing we're talking about, is the thing we're looking at. We're not you and me, we're us. So if we can sit side by side at the table and I can hear your opinion of me, whether it's good or bad, without attacking or withdrawing, that is vulnerability. That is where strength lies. Now, emotion's going to come up, but I can take responsibility for that emotion. Whether I believe what you're saying or not, right? Then I am empowered. So we can engage with the other person and connect with the other person no matter what, right? We can allow for the discomfort without attacking or withdrawing. And that's really what unconditional love and intimacy is between two people. When we're willing to love them anyway, right? Whatever their opinion is, this allows us to show up in that relationship as the wise adult. And I love something else that that Natalie Clay, my mentor, talks about. She says that what if we just assume the best, right? Can we assume the best in each other? That we're all just trying to do our best. And sometimes we show up as an adaptive child because that's what we know, right? And it's not about trying to have someone be right or wrong or you against me. It's like, let's come together as us, assuming we're doing our best so that we can solve the problem at hand instead of going against each other. You and me doesn't create connection. We do. We become an us, and that's where connection comes from. So my invitation to you is to pay attention to how you are showing up in your relationships. Is there a relationship that is challenging for you and you notice yourself having a story about how things are happening to you? Or do you notice yourself blaming the other person? Or do you notice yourself complaining about that other person and spiraling into a negative habit? Or do you find the need to defend yourself against that other person? Or do you find yourself wanting to escape and avoid and distance yourself, right? Those are clues that you are operating from your adaptive child. And so I invite you to use those as clues to be able to step back and recognize for what it is without judgment or shame, just acknowledging it, right? Like, oh, that's so interesting that I am going to blame, or that's so interesting that I went right to complaining. I wonder why. Or I wonder why that I feel like I have to escape, or that I don't want to share. Or I wonder why that I feel like I have to defend myself. Use those as clues to help you see that adaptive child and how you're being disempowered. And then create a pause, right? Create a pause and invite the wise adult in. What's another way to look at it? Can you assume the best? And can you start viewing that relationship as we or us? That's all I have for you today. Thank you for being here. And I hope that you have found something that will help you strengthen that connection in your relationships. Thank you for tuning in to the Seasons of Joy podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. And if you liked what you heard, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share with your friends and family. If you want to learn more about me or how to work with me, just visit my website, www.seasons-coaching.com, and have a joyful week.